From a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, how to maintain a semblance of confidence when the hardware store attendant is upselling his big screws. And now, the podcast host who has no problem with upselling hardware items, especially if it involves flexing and lifting heavy objects, Pete Dominic!
Oh, that's right. I am always flexing and lifting heavy objects, if of those objects are my own anguish, folks. No, I'm kidding. Everything is great. I had an awesome weekend with my pals from high school. It's great to be back here with you. Stang Bang 3 is what we called it, and it is over, and nobody got hurt, their feelings, or physically. So we had an awesome time up in the Adirondacks with like 17 of my high school buddies, and I highly recommend that you get away with your pals if you have some pals to get away with. If not, make some pals or get away with me. Let's plan a trip, shall we? Awesome show. Joining me today for the first time ever is Alex Aronson, who is a former Division of Civil Rights lawyer at the Department of Justice. He was also a staff lawyer on the Judiciary Committee working in Sheldon Whitehouse's office. He's a former community organizer who worked to open up the vote in Oregon, where he is from, and he is a very important player at this point when it comes to exposing the frauds on the right in the Federalist Society and transparency in the money to justices. Such an important conversation with a really, really very important key player right now in this conversation. I think you're going to love Alex Aronson, who's joining me for the first time here on the show for his coming out party. He's done, I think, at least one other podcast, but I think you're about to see this guy everywhere. So I think you're going to love Alex Aronson. But first, let's just get briefly to the news. Over the weekend, a massive train crash killing hundreds in India. A tiny plane crash near Washington, D.C. that had fighter jets scrambling from Andrews Air Force Base and apparently shocking people when they broke the sound barrier to chase this plane down. I guess the guy, I'm not quite sure at this point what happened, but he crashed alone, it would seem, the pilot, but they thought it might be a threat. So a train crash, a plane crash, and a massive jobs splash. A jobs splash. How about that? The May numbers were huge, much better than expected in what's being called a resilient labor market. 339,000 new jobs added in May, crushing expectations. Joe Biden looking good, having a great weekend because he fixes the debt ceiling thing, pretty much, not to anybody's satisfaction, but we stave off worldwide economic collapse. And then these job numbers, he's going to look good for that. And then, oh no, he just fell down on stage at the Air Force Academy when he tripped on a sandbag. Who the hell put that sandbag right there? Then he appeared to hit his head when he got out of Marine One as he landed at the White House. So he's not having a good weekend by that measure. And obviously his critics are pouncing all over that and printing all kinds of different stories and talking about it for hours and hours on end. But I'm not going to. I really don't think it's worth much time here. But let me know if you do. Obviously, he's an 80-year-old man. It's always disconcerting if he trips and falls. And so we should probably keep the sandbags out of his ways, you idiots. Over the weekend, also saw that The Atlantic had a really huge story about CNN's Chris Licht, a devastating profile dogging the CNN boss, who felt so confident in his plan to reinvent cable news that he allowed extraordinary months-long access to a magazine writer named Tim Alberto, who painted a brutal portrait of the head of one of the most famous, consequential, and profitable brands and what's destined, Axios says, to become an iconic magazine profile. Tim Alberto wrote the piece, and Puck News' Dylan Byers, a very wired regular on the CNN beat, said that Chris Licht has lost the support of CNN staff, and perhaps the man who matters the most, his boss, David Zaslav, is the president and CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery. Tim Alberto's 15,000-word piece in The Atlantic, I started reading it. It's really very interesting if you pay attention to these media stories, and it's a pretty important story. It's titled, Inside the Meltdown at CNN. So I think that was a pretty big news story over the weekend as well. Oh, and this Chuck Todd stepping down from Meet the Press will be replaced by Kirsten Welker, and apparently nobody is disappointed. Nobody. except for maybe Chuck Todd, who's trying to own it and say that he wanted to step down to spend more time with his family. Okay, let him have that spin. I didn't do that when I got forced out, but hey, listen, I'm sure it was his choice. I have no idea. And I should say I don't care. I do care. I'm glad that he's stepping down. I think Kirsten Welker is going to be a whole lot better in that corporate Sunday news show. That's my take, at least. And let's see what to look for this week. It is Monday, after all. Officials from OPEC, Russia, and other countries are meeting this weekend to weigh whether to cut production amid an oil price slump. And it looks like Saudi Arabia will reduce how much oil it sends to the global economy, taking a unilateral step to prop up the sagging price of crude after two previous cuts of supply. Major producing countries in OPEC Plus alliance failed to push oil higher, so expect some higher gas prices for the summer, which is always the case in this rigged cartel. What else to watch for this week? 3 Republicans are expected to enter the presidential race: Chris Christie, Mike Pence, and Doug Burgum. If you don't know who that is, then you are not alone. He's the governor of North Dakota, and I've not heard much of him or about him. So good luck, Doug Burgum. See, can't even say his name. Vice President Kamala Harris will host a meeting of U.S. and Caribbean leaders in the Bahamas on Thursday. President Biden will host Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the White House on Thursday. And in sports, the Women's French Open final is on Saturday, as is the running of the Belmont Stakes, the final leg of the punishing abusive horse races Triple Crown. All right, well, my tech issue tonight is not allowing me to pull sound for the news segment. So, you know what? This conversation with Alex Aronson is so good, you don't need it anyway. So let's get to it, shall we? And remember, I can't do it without you. So, you want to produce the show? You want to be a part of the show? You want to be a guest on the show? Well, you want to be part of our community? If you're not already, please sign up now for a paid subscription for as little as $5. I've noticed several of you have edited your pledge up the last couple weeks, and I really appreciate that because we're just barely scraping by, but I'm making some exciting moves over the next couple of weeks, and hopefully you'll see some changes and some improvements, and maybe we'll be able to track a wider audience. You've always got to promote. It's not the thing. It's not the product I've ever felt. It's just getting it out there, and we've got so many amazing people listening, thousands and thousands of people listening every day, but you got to keep it going so you can keep renewing those subscriptions. It's ad-free right now. It's me in a shed, supported by you, your trust, and the credibility that we've had here for years, bringing you guests like this one. So here's his official intro. In 5 years as a counsel, senior counsel, and chief counsel to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Alex Aronson led Senate investigations, oversight, legislative campaigns to confront anti-democratic judicial influence, ethical misconduct, and abuse of power. He's a political organizer, a civil rights lawyer, and a judicial ethics expert. Alex's work on judicial accountability and right-wing judicial influence has helped elevate these issues to national prominence, laying the groundwork for today's headlines exposing the Supreme Court's corruption and extreme judicial activism. Most recently, he served as the managing director for the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law Center. He was previously an attorney in the Appellate Section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He has helped nationally prominent state-based nonprofit focus on improving voting access for underrepresented communities in Oregon, culminating the nation's first statewide automatic voter registration law. I'm telling you, he's already a hero. He's going to be a bigger one, doing amazing work. Very excited to have him on for the show for the first time. I hope you'll go over to Twitter and let him know that you heard him here and follow him there on Twitter if that's still a thing in your life. Alex Aronson joins us for the first time right now.
Oh, man, I've been telling you all about him. Very excited to finally have him here. He's really, really an important guy. Alex Aronson, welcome to Stand Up. Thank you. That was a weird intro. He's an important guy. I got nervous. I didn't know what to say.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
I think you're an important guy. I think that
we're all important.
I don't know what your family thinks, but I think you're... Tell me a little bit about your work, your career. You know, we know that you were at the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. We know that you worked for a Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and specifically with his role in the Judiciary Committee. But why did you become a lawyer, and why did you become that kind of lawyer?
Sure. Well, I mean, I was an organizer, political organizer, before I became a lawyer, and it was my experience, my frustrations in the political organizing space that led me to law school. I was a state-based organizer in Oregon working on voting rights issues, trying to expand the franchise, pass things like election day voter registration. The outfit I worked for helped pass the first automatic voter registration law in the country. And even back then, this was like early 2000s, mid 2000s, we were confronting the same nonsense that we're seeing in the political arena now. Groups like ALEC and the State Policy Network, who were advancing, fraudulent election integrity narratives to stop people from being able to vote. This was an anti-democracy effort that we were confronting even back then. So, it was that sort of formative experience of like coming up against that bad faith pushback from the right that made me think I need to develop the legal tools to understand what's going on here so I can push back against them more effectively.
Just real quick, help us understand the argument around democracy in America or anywhere else, and if there is any way to understand why you would want to make it harder for American citizens in this case that are 18 years old to vote. Because it would seem to me that if you go to the roots of wherever democracy was born, Greece or somewhere, you would want as many people to have access to voting as possible. That is a long fight in America. We know the history there. But in terms of democracy, don't you want, for a healthy democracy, no matter what your ideology is, you want people to be able to vote easily?
I think that's, uncontroversially true, right? I think it goes to the premise of whether these people really want a healthy, functioning democracy. Right. And I think that's where the rub is, right? I think they very clearly at this point, and we can see this from the evidence, they don't want that. They want themselves in power. They want, their friends in power. They want oligarchs in power. They want white people in power, Christians in power. They don't want black and brown communities in power, people who don't agree with their worldview. And so, the strategy, rather than trying to broaden the tent, trying to moderate their positions to appeal to a broader populace, is to, increasingly look for ways to cut those communities out of power. And that is why we have seen this kind of multi-decade effort, in the legal context and the political context, to, erode, access to the franchise across those communities.
Real quick on Oregon and several other states, you become automatically enrolled to vote, and then you can vote. Is it in Oregon and a couple other states? It's entirely mail-in?
Yeah, Oregon's vote by mail entirely. It has been for a long time.
Why?
Oregon's a real innovator in the voting space.
Why? How was that sold? People generally want to go to the booth. They want to cast their vote. They want to see it happen. Why was that a motivation? And how is it not? How is it safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think vote by mail in Oregon happened before, all of these kind of political dynamics really came to the fore in the kind of democracy space. I think if you saw an effort, and in fact, you see kind of ALEC and State Policy Network pushing back against efforts to expand automatic voter registration and vote by mail today. But before then, it was just a matter of access and education. I mean, one of the great things about vote by mail in Oregon is not only the convenience of it, but the opportunity for better education. They send a pretty good and informative voter guide to voters so that they can take time with their decisions, that they're not rushed in the voting booth. So I think there are some really great aspects to going to a voting booth to cast your ballot. I think it kind of fosters civic spirit. I remember very clearly when I was a kid going with my parents to vote. That was, formative for me as somebody that wanted to be engaged in the democracy. But I think there's some real advantages to having these conveniences and better opportunities for education.
Real quick, one more personalish question. You mentioned your parents. Like, were you a community organizer? Why did you care so much about voting and democracy? Like, who were you growing up? How were you so impressed upon that? Usually young people are fairly apathetic about such things.
Yeah, I don't know. I grew up in a community where people cared about each other. My parents certainly fostered those values of civic engagement and kind of social justice in me as a kid. I came of age, in a pretty heady time in American politics. I was a high school senior when Bush versus Gore was decided by the Supreme Court. That put my antennas up about the kind of role of the Supreme Court in society and really cast my focus on the judiciary as an important kind of component of our politics. And then I went to college. 9/11 happened my first couple of weeks of college, and there was a lot of campus organizing, and the Iraq War started, so I was involved in efforts to push back against that. And then in the 2004 election, I was in West Philadelphia. I was working as a volunteer with a law student group. I was an undergrad, but working with the law students on voter protection. And there was systematic voter suppression happening in the streets of Philadelphia. I witnessed it. And so that was formative for me and really inspired me to kind of think about voter access to the franchise, voter suppression as a dynamic happening in our society, and wanting to be part of the solution to that.
Yeah, Philadelphia and voter suppression. There's a long history of hijinks in that city, obviously, mostly a black city, right? A lot of black voters. And therefore, you look at the rest of the state, you got to win Philadelphia. So that's interesting because you're a community organizer. You realize this issue, this problem, you get involved, but you decide the path to be more of a solution is law school. You never once, so when you go to law school, this is why you went to get involved, and was the goal always Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division?
It was always something like that. I didn't have a super clear idea of where I would end up, and I followed a pretty traditional sort of like law student path. I worked for a federal judge as a clerk. I spent some time at a big law firm, which was really interesting. And, I learned a lot about the kind of the way that like the profession of law works in that sense, a lot of what's wrong with law, frankly. And then, this opportunity to come to the Justice Department to be a civil rights lawyer was a dream for me. I was an appellate lawyer and kind of what's widely sort of known as the crown jewel of the Department of Justice, a division that had this amazing history of fighting for civil rights and being at the forefront of achieving those rights. And so that opportunity was like amazing. It was a dream job for me. It only lasted 10 months because Donald Trump became president.
Oh, you were there for that short. I didn't realize you were there for, you started there in 2015 then.
Spring of 2016. So I kind of took a bet. I think like a lot of Americans was feeling pretty comfortable that the outcome of the 2016 presidential would turn out differently than it did. And so it was, certainly a rude awakening, much more for the country than for me personally, but I definitely had some decisions to make.
What happened the day after the election, the weeks after the election at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division? What was that like during the transition period?
It was pretty heavy. I mean, I experienced the 2016 election. I was on the job. I was working as an election monitor in Fulton County, Georgia, for the Department of Justice. So, it was a lot like my experience in Philadelphia. I saw a lot of disinformation, a lot of lack of information.
Did you see any suitcases?
I didn't see any suitcases. Somehow I missed the suitcases. But, I spent the day kind of like on the ground, like watching democracy in action with all of its kind of flaws. And then, that decision came down and it landed like a brick on a lot of us, because I think, on some level, lawyers in the Justice Department are particularly the career lawyers are there to kind of, follow the law and be law enforcement officers. But particularly in a division like the Civil Rights Division, it draws people like me who have a kind of deeply held commitment to kind of civil rights principles. And so when, soon after the election, during the transition, Trump's acting attorney general, who was, a defense employment discrimination lawyer, Mike Pence's lawyer, came in and told us that we would be executing Trump campaign promises through the Civil Rights Division. That didn't sit well with most of us. And so I think a lot of us sort of were like figuring out like, how can I still hold to my values and still do my job here? And everybody made sort of different decisions about how they would proceed.
Well, but I feel like I heard you say this before. That's actually not that controversial, is it? Like when a new administration takes over, it sounds super controversial and scandalous even to say you're going to, they walk in the DOJ, Civil Rights Division, say you're going to uphold these campaign promises. If it were Barack Obama's acting AG and he said, and those campaign promises are to, create access and all the good things about democracy that he supported, that would have been fine. Right. So it wasn't a scandal. That's not news.
Yeah, I didn't find that to be particularly scandalous. I did find it to be disturbing. Sure. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't really a surprise to me. And you're right. I mean, I think these are complicated questions about the role of politics in our law enforcement and in the separation of kind of political decision making from Department of Justice law enforcement. And there's a lot of protocol, a lot of tradition, a lot of norms around those distinctions. But certainly on some level, the president, it's important for the president to be able to enact, core policy preferences through the Department of Justice. Now, of course, during the Trump administration, we saw those guardrails, all of those guardrails around independence and around the lack of kind of politicization of law enforcement completely broken down by the Trump administration, with countless examples of sort of just abuse of power and rampant politicization of law enforcement. I think we saw that kind of manifested recently in this kind of really paper-thin Durham report that led to failed indictments and the like.
One of the craziest things, I always think one of the craziest things is that Jeff Sessions was Donald Trump's choice for Attorney General, first choice, and Jeff Sessions was the first senator to endorse Donald Trump, and he was a sycophant. He was a dyed-in-the-wool supporter. He then, however, appointed a special prosecutor, Mueller, to investigate, and then that was it for his relationship with Trump. And, Trump destroyed Jeff Sessions forever. I haven't heard hide nor hair of that guy. I don't know where he is. I'm just ranting and raving. Why did you leave DOJ?
Well, it just felt like a critical moment, a real inflection point for democracy. It was really interesting actually in our section because, we had these lawyers who were like, amazing career-long civil rights lawyers. And during the W. Bush administration, they had been the targets of political persecution. These bad actors from places like the Heritage Foundation, like Hans von Spakovsky or J. Christian Adams, these kind of leading right-wing advocates for kind of these completely fraudulent voter suppression theories, really targeted these colleagues of mine, these more senior colleagues of mine. And I watched them, and they sort of stuck it out. They were reassigned. They were forced to work on things they didn't believe in. They sort of stuck it out. That wasn't the decision I decided to make. I needed to be and I also sort of saw Trump as a kind of a unique and very different threat to democracy than perhaps even W. Bush had been, as bad and as war criminally as W was. And so, I was like, how can I be a part of the solution here again? And that's how I found my way to the Senate and the Senate Judiciary Committee working for Sheldon Whitehouse, who is, a really amazing champion for the rule of law.
Yeah. We like Sheldon Whitehouse. How do you, when you go to work for a senator who's on, in this case, the Judiciary Committee, is your work entirely with the Judiciary Committee? Or are you doing other work for that senator? And is it different from office to office?
It can vary from office to office and from committee to committee, but on the Judiciary Committee, there's enough going on at that committee that, you're pretty fully engaged with the work of the committee. And the jurisdiction of that committee is quite broad. So, we weren't only, working on judicial nominations. We were also, doing Department of Justice oversight work. Department of Homeland Security work, working on issues like copyright. So like the jurisdiction is really broad, and we had our hands full certainly with the work of that committee, particularly given the focus of the Senate Republicans on kind of just basically creating a judicial conveyor belt to put these reactionaries on the court. Yeah.
So just the obvious work is putting the Supreme Court nominations, and you were there for both Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, which I want to get into. And then obviously lower court nominations. What happened during that time? Like, what was the work outside of those two things? And maybe that was all it was. Maybe you were entirely focused on the nominations themselves, or what else do you do in the Judiciary Committee, especially working for a guy like Whitehouse? There's a lot of dumb people in Congress and even in the U.S. Senate, really dumb, like super stupid, like Tommy Tuberville. And I mean, really, really stone cold stupid. You know that a lot better than I do. Whitehouse is one of the smartest. He's also one of the, most transparent. And that's because one of his main focuses is transparency. He's written books. He's been outspoken about the capture of the court and even of the Congress in many ways, special interest money. We love him for that reason. But what were you doing with him? What were you guys doing?
So, working for Senator Whitehouse is a little different from working for, I think, a lot of the members of Congress, because I think he thinks differently about his role as a legislator than I think a lot of folks. I think he really takes seriously his role as like a public educator to sort of use his platform, use his investigative resources that he has as a senator to really kind of understand what's happening in our country and explain it to the American people. And so certainly as we engaged in the day-to-day and week-to-week work of the committee, and it was really crazy times back then. Let's not forget, this is like 2017. There were scandals happening like every 3 hours. And so we were doing a lot of kind of just like rapid response. What does the Constitution say about, the census citizenship question, and, whether the Commerce Department can like pretextually add this to the census. So like, a lot of scrambling and things like that. And then, and the judicial nominations work was like breakneck speed. They were rushing to confirm these judges. But, particularly given like what was very clear, a very clear agenda to sort of focus on Republican policymaking through judicial selection. And Don McGahn has spoken specifically about that, talking about how the deregulatory program of the Trump administration is really the other side of the same coin as judicial selection. They're picking these judges to advance their interests. As we saw that pattern sort of unfolding, we thought it was really important to sort of take a step back and look at how this was happening, tell the story, really understand how we had come to this place in American society where the courts had become such a political weapon, who was responsible for making that so, and kind of telling this broader story, doing the investigations to kind of really understand the role of dark money, the coordination of all of these kind of front groups that are behind not only the selection of judges, but also the creation of the doctrines that the judges ultimately adopt as constitutional law. So kind of doing that kind of broader public education work was, I think, a really important part of our work in that office. And that Sheldon, I think, continues to do through his extracurricular work like the book and his approach to some of the, questions in confirmation hearings and the like. Yeah,
the book, I interviewed him for it, captured the corporate infiltration of American democracy, is such an important book because, it picks up, I think, on where Jane Meyer left off with her book, Dark Money. But it's because the reason it's important is because it's a fucking sitting senator writing it. It's not like it's a journalist or an activist. This guy, your former boss, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, wrote a book called Captured, like that the Senate is captured, that the Congress is captured. It's a really, really important book. And, talk about public education. Everybody should read that. And I'll never forget when that came out. I was like, you wrote this while you're in the Senate. Awesome. Credibility. Talk to me about the Kavanaugh hearing first. What is it that you think people don't know enough about that time, that process, and what was missed? What was I'm sure you'll use probably more a different kind of language. It wasn't missed; it was done on purpose.
Yeah, the Kavanaugh confirmation was it for me. It's almost like a perfect distillation of everything that's gone wrong with American politics in the last 6 or so years. The rending of our lived experience from the kind of political reality that we're watching unfurl before our eyes. The complete abandonment of truth and this destruction of norms in the quest for power. I think so much has been missed in what happened with Brett Kavanaugh, who repeatedly lied to get himself on the Supreme Court, who was supported by a very complicated and well-orchestrated series of cover-ups to hide not only lies that he told in his earlier confirmation proceedings as a circuit judge, but sexual assault that he committed against these women, and very coordinated, very clear, efforts to bury this stuff that, I think on some level we know happened, but on another level has not been fully explained. And I on this, I sort of pin some blame on the media for sort of, not really telling the story completely or with sufficient urgency. And I pin some blame on the Democrats, frankly, for the way those proceedings, proceeded, and also just for sort of letting the issue drop. We've sort of allowed this guy to normalize himself as, John Roberts' moderate buddy on the Supreme Court. He is a perjurer and somebody who sexually assaulted women and lied about it.
What about the witnesses that weren't heard? What about the investigations that weren't done?
So, there were kind of speaking specifically about these sexual assault allegations. Of course, there was the first one that came out from Dr. Ford. That one, was, there was a huge spin effort to try to bury that. There was a lot of resistance from the Senate Republicans to even having that hearing to allow her to come speak her experience to tell the American people what had happened to her. Then there was an independent allegation from a woman named Deborah Ramirez that basically never saw the light of day. There were efforts from Senate Democrats to have her testimony heard before the committee for the country to hear it. Those were rejected. She wasn't allowed to testify. When her lawyers brought, dozens upon dozens of witnesses to the committee, to the FBI, to suggest that they be interviewed to corroborate Ramirez's testimony, they were not interviewed. There was one senator, Senator Chris Coons, brought to Senator Grassley and the FBI's attention a witness that had come to his office who had witnessed with his own eyes Brett Kavanaugh sexually assault another woman at Yale, and tried to get the committee to interview him and make his testimony part of the record. The FBI didn't talk to him. The committee didn't talk to him. They proceeded to confirm Judge Kavanaugh anyway. And so, all of this kind of spins together a very clear story of a concerted cover-up to keep the truth out of public eye and to put this guy in a life-tenured position on the Supreme Court where he can proceed to, enact this special interest agenda that is taking away our freedoms and, ruling for the wealthy few over and over again.
There's always been this controversy, this rumor, this conspiracy around who paid off Brett Kavanaugh's $200,000 credit card debts and a $92,000 country club fee. I read this reporting from Mother Jones that debunks that and that it's really not the issue that a lot of progressives want to see it as. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think my major thought is that we don't know. The answer is we don't know because they didn't tell us, because Kavanaugh didn't tell us. Chuck Grassley, who led this confirmation and buried hundreds of thousands of pages of White House records while describing the confirmation as the most transparent in history, didn't make him answer that question. And Democrats didn't have the power to do so. We asked him in written questions, Senator Whitehouse did, about those debts. And he answered vaguely, cryptically, sort of suggested that his parents had paid off those debts without actually saying that. And so I think, it's completely legitimate for people to have those questions. It's legitimate until they're answered.
Do you think there's other shoes to drop on Brett Kavanaugh? Do you think there's any potential that he or, frankly, Clarence Thomas is removed from the court?
I think we're pretty far from having the kind of political capital to actually, bring articles of impeachment against these judges and secure their convictions in the Senate. I think we've got a broken enough politics, and we've got a Republican Party that is committed enough to protecting them in power on the court that is not a realistic sort of eventuality, which isn't to say we shouldn't be pushing for those things. On Kavanaugh, I do think there's some other shoes to drop for sure. I know Senator Whitehouse is developing a report after his years-long investigation, which I helped lead, into the FBI's so-called supplemental investigation into Kavanaugh, examining exactly what constraints were placed by the Trump White House on that investigation. And I think we need to hear, frankly, from this guy, from Max Stier, who is the Yale classmate that watched Brett Kavanaugh sexually assault another woman, and who was on tape in this forthcoming film called Justice that aired at Sundance. And I've seen a screener of the film and I've heard the tape, and it is vivid and disturbing. And he sees Brett Kavanaugh with his own sober eyes sexually assaulting a woman in exactly the manner that Deborah Ramirez alleged that he had done to her. And so, I think it's incumbent on Max, who is a public figure. He's married to a federal judge. I can understand the complications and difficulties of coming forward with that testimony. But I think there's a critical public interest that demands hearing from him on it. And I think when he does, and I think he will ultimately sort of have to share that experience, I think, it's just going to be untenable for him to remain silent for posterity. Then I think, yes, there will be a shoe that drops because it will be clear that Kavanaugh lied about this.
Wow. I didn't know about that film. I'll have to look into it. Okay. Well, the FBI is filled with radical left-wing people. So why would they, cover up anything? When you hear that accusation about the FBI being liberal or filled with Democrats or left-wing radicals, what do you, based on your experience, think when you hear those types of criticisms being made of the FBI.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's deplorable, right? I think this is broadly speaking an attack on our government institutions, on our civil service, on the idea that government is legitimate. It's obviously motivated by bad faith. We see evidence that people like Kash Patel are paying the purported whistleblowers that are coming before this weaponization committee. I think the indicia of bad faith are evident. At the same time, as our investigation into this Kavanaugh situation makes clear, none of these institutions should be above scrutiny or accountability or oversight. So I think, they're oversimplifying, a very complicated and nuanced dynamic here that I think requires real thought and real care.
Before we get to the big headline issue that you're concerned about and working on, captured courts, Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society, I do want to ask you about Amy Coney Barrett. So that was a pretty controversial appointment simply because of how it happened, when it happened. What do we not know or need to know or be reminded about her confirmation?
Well, she was confirmed 8 days before the presidential election, right? And I think that's critical to keep in mind vis-a-vis what happened to Merrick Garland, who was nominated months before the election. And we were told that he couldn't even have a hearing because the voters needed a say.
When Obama nominated Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court.
For the Supreme Court, right.
It's confusing for people.
Sorry about that. After Antonin Scalia died, Garland was, of course, nominated to the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell refused to even give him a hearing. And then, so created this sort of so-called Garland rule, which he immediately kind of reversed himself on. Yeah. And I think it's really critical. And I sort of fault Democrats for letting this issue sort of drop. I think it's a critical inflection point again for American democracy. It's to me, I think the clearest kind of maneuver in the right wings and in the Republican Party's theft of the Supreme Court in this quest for power. And so I think Coney Barrett is examining her record, examining her own kind of preconceived notions about the law and about the world is very important. I think she very much fits the mold of the other kind of movement lawyers that Trump and McConnell focused on getting confirmed to the court so that they could have judges that they could rely upon to give them the outcomes they want, which is exactly what's happened.
It's exactly what's happened. Anything about her confirmation hearing that was really controversial that we need to that we don't know or should be reminded of? The hearing itself?
Well, the hearing itself, I mean, I think, frankly, the thing that most people remember about the hearing is Senator Feinstein giving Lindsey Graham a hug at the end of it. And I think that, that really, I think, distills the way in which the Democrats have not, I think, fully come to terms with just how weaponized and political kind of these court fights have become, even though they've been in the room for them the whole time, right? And, that hug to Lindsey Graham sort of gave the country the impression that this was business as usual, that this was a normal confirmation of a normal judge under normal circumstances. And it very much wasn't.
Well, you mentioned Dianne Feinstein. I was planning on asking you about her. And by the way, she thought that when she hugged him, apparently she thought he was John McCain. That's not funny and it's not fair and no one should be laughing. But the point is, the controversy now, you have a really interesting opinion about this, and correct me where I'm wrong. If she were to resign, or even die, I guess, but if she were to resign, which would be more likely, I suppose, there's no controversy about whether or not the governor of California can appoint a temporary senator. No controversy. There's controversy of who you might appoint and who, Nancy Pelosi might want versus who, what Governor Newsom's political ambitions are, that he wants to appoint a black woman, whatever. You got three Congress people running, Adam Schiff, Katie Porter, and Barbara Lee. But the controversy, I believe, is about the Judiciary Committee, meaning if Dianne Feinstein resigns, Newsom appoints a new senator, no controversy there. He or she comes to the Senate. But the issue is that the Senate appointing a new senator, and it wouldn't have to be her replacement, obviously. Chuck Schumer, I guess, can appoint anybody he wants, but that Republicans wouldn't allow for it. Therein lies the concern, and I think your opinion is that's why, unfortunately, she has to stay, because if we don't have her, then we won't have anyone, and if we don't have anyone, then we can't do what? Do I have it right?
Potentially. I mean, I think it's not totally clear. There's an organizing resolution in place that would give Republicans some ability to frustrate Schumer's attempt to replace Senator Feinstein in the Judiciary Committee, assuming she resigns. But it ultimately comes down to the filibuster. For the Republicans to take that sort of extraordinary obstructionist step would be, as far as I know, unprecedented. It would be quite extreme, and I think there's a real question about whether they would actually escalate to that level of hardball, as craven and sort of cynical as their behavior has shown them to be.
But to be clear, I really don't know how this works. The Senate the Republicans would filibuster the appointment, like you would need 60 votes for an appointment, not 51.
To put her on the committee, they would need to basically, redo the rules that set the committee structures and set the committee memberships, and that would be subject to the filibuster. But if they did take that really extraordinary step, I think it's there's a reason. I don't know. I haven't followed this incredibly closely, but it's hard for me to imagine that even people who are against filibuster reform, like Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema, would just swallow that. It would be quite an affront to sort of the congressional majority, the Senate majority. But it's a possibility, right? It's a total possibility that, they would make that obstructionist step, and, sort of corporate Democrats like Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin would not be willing to break the filibuster. And the result then would be, yes, that the Democrats would not have the votes on the Senate Judiciary Committee to move their nominees out of the committee. So it's a dicey political situation.
So to be clear, the Senate, the Judiciary Committee, Democrats would not be able to, without that Democrat, if she's gone, they wouldn't be able to get judges out of, and why does that matter?
Without Republican support. They would need Republican support to do that. Well, because, there's not that many things that we can do, through the Senate at this point, right? Confirming judges is one of the few things we can do. With a Republican controlled House, there's not that much the Senate can do besides confirm judges. Now, I think there's real strategic questions about prioritization of this stuff. I mean, at this point, there's a huge slowdown that's independent of Dianne Feinstein's, issues. And that's in the form of this blue slip, which is, serving as a veto power effectively for Republican senators, for red state senators, against any nomination that the president wants to make to judges in those states. And that's a pretty much invented Senate norm that Republicans abandoned when it came to circuit judges. They kept in place for the district judges. But now, because it's still in place and the Judiciary Chairman, Durbin, is respecting that rule, these Republican senators all have a veto power over any appointment in their states. And so it's not like we're confirming a lot of judges anyway.
Not a big fan of Senator Durbin. I want to like him, but he doesn't seem to be that, I'm just going to say strong. What's your what do you want to say publicly about Senator Durbin and his leadership on that committee?
I mean, I have a huge amount of respect for Senator Durbin. Same as with Senator Feinstein. I have just enormous respect for the careers they've had, for the public service they've done. When I first got to the Judiciary Committee, being in a room with Dick Durbin was powerful to me. He spoke with amazing passion and earnestness, and clearly with a lot of sincerity about issues he cared a lot about: criminal justice reform, immigration. And I think that he has done a great job under the Biden administration, advancing these judges. He's confirmed some really great judges. But, I share your concerns about his kind of lack of fight when it comes to the threat posed specifically by these MAGA judges on the Supreme Court and the lower courts. I think, let's take an example like Justice Thomas's, blatant corruption that has been sort of dominating headlines. And to his credit, he held a hearing to air some of these issues out. But the hearing itself was pretty technocratic. It was dry. It was focused on ethics. And, what we need is, political leadership who can speak with passion and, frankly, outrage, to speak the outrage that we as Americans are feeling as this corrupt court and its, corrupt MAGA majority continues to destroy all of our freedoms. Let's respond with appropriate urgency. Let's not act like this is business as usual. Yeah. And let's actually get to the bottom of it. A hearing on ethics laws is not going to get to the bottom of, the corrupt scheme being run through the justices of the Supreme Court by a special interest cabal.
Oh, let's get into the special interest cabal. Oh, wait, before we do, Clarence Thomas, are you surprised by anything that we've learned from the investigations in journalism and his relationships with, by the way, his wife? We've almost forgotten to talk about Ginny Thomas and what she's clearly been guilty of doing. It's all on the record now, around January 6th specifically. But, it's like we forgot that only because of even worse corruption with Harlan Crow. Are you surprised by any of it? Did you know that stuff was happening?
Well, sort of on some level, yeah. I mean, we've known about Harlan Crow and Justice Thomas's relationship with Crow for over a decade now. Groups like Common Cause were on the case back in 2011, and there's now, I think, pretty compelling evidence that in the face of, legitimate, well-founded complaints by those groups back then, Chief Justice Roberts and the Judicial Conference sort of buried their head in the sand. They allowed this kind of scheme to continue. And, even going back to Justice Scalia, we know there was an extensive personal hospitality scheme through which they were, getting all these trips and, yacht trips and hunting trips and not disclosing them as part of this kind of exemption for personal hospitality. So on one level, I'm not surprised at all. I've spent years now kind of studying these influence networks and how they seek to kind of wield power through this type of influence. On the other hand, some of the specific disclosures are absolutely shocking. Like Harlan Crow bought his mother's house and she's living there rent free. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's completely bonkers. So, yeah, I mean, and then the scale of it is also just jaw dropping. $500,000 yacht ships to Indonesia. I mean, it's just wild. So, again, it kind of goes back to given the kind of scale of corruption we see on plain display, where's the appropriate and proportionate political response from?
Well, the appropriate, my opinion is the appropriate response now. Well, there isn't one, because there used to be even a sniff of scandal, and media would go crazy, and people on both sides of the aisle would be like, "Well, you can't do that. You can't have an affair with a woman. You can't take money from this special interest. You can't do." Now, my feeling, I'd love to be wrong about it. Maybe there's more nuance here, is the only thing that matters is winning. So it doesn't matter if Clarence Thomas, is caught red-handed. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump or any Republican politician, because I think Democrats still obviously have a higher standard. I mean, we saw what happened to Al Franken, but there's so many other issues that we on the left, or whatever you want to call us, in reality, we see that and we're like, well, that's no good. You're going to get primaried because you can't be doing that. But my feeling is that there is no such thing as scandal on the right. There's only winning. It doesn't matter how you get there. If you cheated, if you did it illegally, if you, suppressed the vote, whatever, as long as you win. Do you see it differently?
No, I see it that way. Yeah. It's power. It's about power.
Okay. Well, that was the shortest possible and easiest answer. No, I agree. Sadly, that's the case. Let's get to, Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society's, 50 years or so plan to really dominate our lives, American life, culture, through the courts. Not only the Supreme Court. We hear so much about the Supreme Court. We should be talking a lot more about the Fifth Circuit or lower courts, obviously. Take us back. All of the threads. The players. The history. I think that creates huge value for everybody in media to be talking to you, and for everybody else to be organizing. We're way behind, but to be organizing to compete with the Leonard Leos, the Federalist Societies, which is going to be hard because they have been given like $1 billion for the future. They just were gifted. And of course, the only thing I would add is Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society, sent Donald Trump a list of who he should support. And he was like, okay, I'll appoint these people, whatever. Like, he didn't care. He knew that would make a difference. Obviously, they overturned abortion. You can pick up from there. Talk to me, give us some history. And I think probably you're going to give us a serious analysis as to what we're facing.
Yeah. Well, thanks. So, and just on that one point about Trump not caring, I mean, I heard that from Don McGahn, his White House counsel, straight from his mouth. I mean, we were talking, we were in a meeting where we were talking about judicial nominations, and, he basically made plain that he presented judges to the president and the president signed off on them.
And McGahn got that list from
For the judges, I think McGahn was instrumental in creating it with Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo, who was the executive vice president and board chair of the Federalist Society. He's still the board chair, but has moved on from his kind of paid role on their staff. And the Federalist Society is just critical to understanding the kind of a modern American right, the threat posed by this MAGA majority on the Supreme Court. And the list that you referenced, I think was a critical piece of the end of their plan to really capture and control the judiciary. And we could start with that. It was a list that gave Trump a huge amount of life in the Republican primary and in the general. They were not Trump fans, the Federalist Society kind of establishment. But they saw a huge opportunity in him to advance this.
Well, they saw a guy who would be the vehicle that would stamp whatever they wanted. Like George Bush, no other president. Most presidents, given that power, it's very much their legacy who they support, appoint to the Supreme Court. They take that very seriously. Every previous president. This guy did not care, and it sounds like you're about to tell me Leo and McGahn and the rest knew that. They would use him all the way to the top.
Yeah, and he rubber stamped the list, and he said, and he used it to fuel his campaign. He said, "I've got a great list of judges. They're all picked by the Federalist Society, and that's going to be who I choose for the Supreme Court and for the lower courts." And that's what he did. I think it's important to understand the Federalist Society. They sort of hold themselves out as a intellectual debating society for conservative lawyers, and they do that stuff, right? They have debates, they go to law schools, and they have the conversations, and they have events where they talk about stuff. But kind of behind the scenes, under the surface, what they are is sort of like the tip of the spear of a very well coordinated and hugely funded political network that is focused on power building and on changing our laws primarily through the courts and through the adoption of radical doctrines that have no basis in constitutional text or originalism or history or anything. They're just making up rules that will serve their own interests and driving them through the courts. To understand the Federalist Society, you have to go back, decades, to an effort that was launched by one of the Federalist Society's biggest allies, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in a 1971 memo that was drafted by a lawyer named Lewis Powell, who, basically wrote the blueprint for corporate America to dominate American life through engagement in politics broadly, but specifically through engagement in the courts.
The Powell memo.
The Powell memo.
Google.
And Lewis Powell, was confirmed to the Supreme Court. I think it was a year after he wrote that memo, did not disclose the memo in his confirmation proceedings. So, you can see the sort of like manipulation of the confirmation process and the lack of candor even back then in furtherance of this agenda. And the basic premise of the Powell memo was, engage the business community in these political spaces so that we can enact our kind of libertarian, free market, anti-regulatory business agenda. And so there's a clear through line from this decision, from this kind of mobilization of the business community, which happened after the Powell memo, to decisions like we just got last week, in the Sackett case, where the Supreme Court rewrites the law, the Clean Water Act, to make our communities and our wetlands less safe, and our make the water we drink less safe. That is the Powell deregulatory agenda that Don McGahn, as Trump's White House counsel, brought to fruition through the selection of all of these anti-regulatory judges. So I think that one strain is incredibly important to understand, but it's not everything, right? Because the business community didn't, anti-regulation is not going to be the thing that brings the Republican base along for the fight. And to do that trick, they harnessed kind of deep-seated kind of reactionary worldviews around kind of white Christian nationalism, racist backlash to decisions that like the Warren Court made and like we had from the Progress of the Great Society, Brown versus Board of Education. There's a great paper if your listeners want to read it, by a friend of mine who's a political scientist, Calvin Terbeek. It's called Clocks Must Always Turn Backwards. And it's about how originalism, this purported constraint on judicial activism, was created by the National Review as a political backlash to Brown versus Board of Education, to give kind of a legal structure to a racist backlash to Brown versus Board of Education. And similarly, we saw engagement of the religious right around issues like abortion. which brought a huge amount of kind of political momentum and energy to this fight around the courts. And so when I look at the conservative legal movement and the work of the Federalist Society and its broad network of kind of well-funded and coordinated groups that are litigating and active on these issues, those are the sort of three components I really see are, corporate libertarianism, anti-regulatory agenda, racism, and kind of white Christian nationalism, in furtherance of this kind of like, frankly, a theocratic worldview. They're trying to install a kind of theocratic society that imposes this worldview on all of us. And that's where the kind of democracy erosion comes in, because it makes it impossible for us to check it.
And how would you depict where we're at? Because my understanding, and I'm pretty optimistic, but, I talked to Professor Doom and Gloom, Eric Siegel, a lot, and he has been very honest about where we're at. And we're losing, and we're basically going to continue to lose for a couple of more decades unless something changes, like they appoint more judges to the court. I don't know what else could change, but how would you depict, in terms of all the things you just said, corporate dominance, racism, Gilead, the handmaids, like where are we at now, and where do you think we're going?
So, I'm pretty pessimistic about the kind of present reality, but I'm fairly optimistic about the future. And I think that the kind of really bizarre and kind of histrionic Republican reaction that we see to things like the Clarence Thomas corruption scandal and to, increasingly aggressive media investigations and approach to, the court's jurisprudence reflect, I think, a real understanding that their power in this domain is vulnerable, right? The court doesn't have an army that it can send out to enforce its decisions. And its power really does rest on public perceptions of its legitimacy. And listen, as a progressive, as a lawyer, as somebody that's, spent a big part of my career focused on the rule of law, I care a lot about the Supreme Court's legitimacy. I don't want to diminish the court's legitimacy, but I don't see this court majority as having any, right? They were kind of like installed through this kind of corrupt and manipulative distortion of the Constitutional Senate advice and consent process. And they were put there by, oligarchs who want to see them rule in their interests, which is what they're doing. And so I don't have any compunction about trying to, highlight how those justices, those MAGA judges are illegitimate. The reason and Professor Siegel's right. Like, they have taken the mask off. Alito, Thomas, Barrett, even Kavanaugh, with his sort of like, moderation and concurrences on, questions like the Clean Water Act, when it doesn't matter, when his vote does not matter because they already have the votes.
Right.
They're going to do that. They're going to enact this agenda. But I think the touch point is that, it's not tenable in our society. Right. And you can see the outrage in the people as these decisions come down, as our lives get materially worse. Right. As our children are subjected to, school massacres because of fraudulent Second Amendment doctrines driven by the NRA that, like, we are now forced to live with as the new meaning of the Second Amendment. Like, it's just not tenable. And so the reason I'm optimistic is that there is so much room for improvement in terms of, like, the political pushback we could be organizing and fomenting to tell this court, no, you're not in charge. You're not the only one that gets to decide what the Constitution means. There are other democratically accountable actors in this space, and the people themselves have power to constrain you. And so that's where I kind of feel like there's really a lot of room for, constructive organizing and constructive political action to, put the court back in its place, frankly.
You've got me very excited talking to you because, listen, let's just be honest. Siegel's 65. He's been my guy for a long time. He's talking about retiring.
He's good. Eric's good.
He's talking about retiring.
Don't do it. Bro.
For me, I need an expert like you. And what I mean by that is as smart as you and with your moral compass. So, I'm grooming you is what I'm saying. And I'm very excited about,
Don't tell Marjorie.
Your work in the future. Because, I'm really excited to talk to you next time about Heller, about Shelby, about these cases. I've been talking with Eric and others for years and reading about them. But I think you're so passionate and articulate about them, as you just mentioned, the Second Amendment and what it always used to mean up until, very recently. And I really want to hear your thoughts on those. I'm doing all I can to get you on everywhere else, and hopefully you won't forget us here, because your work is really valuable. We'll get more into all of it the next time. This is just the first, hopefully, of many, Alex. I so appreciate, I'm so grateful for your time, and I'm really excited to see what you do next.
Thanks so much, Pete. It's great talking to you.
All right, Alex Aronson. That was our conversation. What did you think? Go follow him on Twitter at Alex Aronson. More information about him in the show notes. By the way, my buddy Lewis, who listens to the show, one of my oldest, bestest friends, said that he didn't really understand what the show notes are. He's my age, I don't know. I thought it was self-explanatory, but maybe I need to explain more about what the show notes are, because there's details for every guest. If you're a subscriber, Lou, I don't think he's even a paid subscriber. Is that possible? You get an email every day. And I could use some more vitamin N pictures from the likes of my Vermont friends. So sign up, Lou, at patreon.com/Pete Dominic right now for a paid subscription. And there'll be show notes in that email. But even if you're not a paid subscriber, wherever you listen to this podcast, check out the show notes and just click on the show, and it should expand on your screen, on your phone, wherever you're listening, and tell you more about me and my guests, more importantly. So check it out. Got any questions? Just email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. But please check out Alex Aronson and follow him on Twitter. Learn more about him. I'm sure you're going to be seeing him a lot more on television, radio, and news sites, sources. And since we talked to Alex about trying to save democracy, here is a great democracy quote from Charles Pickering. A healthy democracy requires a decent society. It requires that we are honorable, generous, tolerant, and respectful. Well, Charles Pickering, I think that means we've got a long way to go. Thank you. And thank you, John Carroll, as always, for singing us in and out. Go check out johncarroll.org right now.
There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, to make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run